Welcome to Media in the Mix, the only podcast produced and hosted by the School of Communication at American University. Join us as we create a safe space to explore topics and communication at the intersection of social justice, tech, innovation, and pop culture. Welcome back to Media in the Mix. Today I'm joined by Aram and Rachel, a sibling duo with a novel coming out in August, correct?
That's correct.
Awesome. Aram, thank you so much for joining us. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. You both are in different locations right now, so I'm happy to get you both here together on the podcast. I heard this is your first podcast where you'll be talking about the book, so extremely honored. Thank you for having it be Media in the Mix.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And yeah, this is the world debut of A Sinn, author.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Wait, so tell us about that a little bit. So sibling duo, A Sinn, how did that name come about? How did you come up with it? Is it kind of just the initials and you were like, let's make it sound like a full name?
Well, to be fair, we kicked around a lot of crazy ideas. We talked about maybe the guy, we would name ourselves after the guy who mentored us when we were both in high school.
Oh, that's awesome.
Or we would take the names of our children and turn them into some kind of an anagram. But at the end of the day, Rach, do you want to explain why we came up with A Sinn?
Well, actually, it was Deborah's suggestion to you, so I think you should.
Right. So we know a lot of TV writers and a lot of writers in general. And our cousin's wife, Deb Kahn, who her most recent show is The Diplomat on Netflix.
Yep.
We were at some family event and we mentioned we had a novel coming out. And she was like, oh my God, your last name is Sinnreich. You've got to use Sinn as your last name. It's so cool. And we were like, it is?
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So it became A Sinn.
It became R for Rachel, A for Aram, Sinn.
That's awesome. And as we're on the subject of, sibling duos, can you tell us maybe for anybody that might want to go into business with a family member or do a project with a family member, can you explain maybe some of the challenges and then also the benefits that you guys had being siblings?
Well, I think I'll speak to the benefit and Aram can speak to the challenges. I think not from a business angle, but from a creative angle, one of the benefits of doing a project with your sibling, hopefully, is that you feel very secure in your love for each other, and that makes it possible to engage in, I think, quite rigorous and critical approaches to whatever the creative project is, because you have the trust that you can say things like, this isn't working, we need to change this, I don't like this, and you still love each other at the end of the end of the day, and hopefully at the end of the project.
Yeah, I think that's true. We do call bullshit on each other a lot, and I think it makes for a better book at the end of the day. I'd say in terms of the downsides, we can only promote to one family network, not two family networks, so we don't have quite the marketing oomph that we would otherwise. And then, of course, having a creative partnership that's also a family relationship means that everything is kind of more freighted with meaning and with kind of secondary and tertiary complexities. So fortunately, Rachel and I have, a long and friendly history as siblings together. But, obviously, we both, like all artists, are working through our own personal psychological histories and traumas through fiction.
Right.
And to the extent that, we live through those traumas together as children, that makes the process of working through it in our art even more complex than it would be normally.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of layers there, which I like and I can appreciate. That's amazing. So are you both professors?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you mind just sharing what you teach in the classroom, each of you?
Well, I'm a historian. So I'm a historian primarily of sexuality, and I teach at the University of Victoria in British Columbia.
And I'm the head of communication studies here at American University, and most of my work comes at the intersection of emerging technology, culture, and law.
Wow. And so how do you both feel, if at all, that you can take these creative projects that you do maybe outside of the classroom, and how does that benefit you inside the classroom? Even if it's something so different as a sci-fi novel versus media law or sexuality or whatever that may be. So is there any part of it that kind of aids in your teaching in the classroom?
Oh, 100%.
Definitely
ahead,
for me. I have a lot of interest in narrative and creative approaches to history, and I think that it plays out really well in the classroom. The students appreciate having sort of like narrative and creative potentials in their assignments or in the way I teach. So I do a lot of teaching with role-playing games. I assign a lot of kind of like writing and creative projects for the students, alternative ways of communicating history that aren't your standard research papers. So I think like my engagement in creative endeavors outside of academic history writing end up benefiting the students.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think when you research technology, it's really hard to communicate to a general audience or even to students like, okay, so Amazon wants to collect your handprint when you check out at Whole Foods. What's wrong with that? Who cares? Right? And so using narrative is a great way to kind of take these abstract ideas about what could go wrong and to concretize them in a way that students and everyday people can understand. And cool. That kind of like, super villainous mind frame, like what could go wrong, is a great place to start a science fiction story. And so they feed back into each other.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, actually. That's awesome. And so that is a perfect segue into our next question, which as I read, one being a historian, the other a futurist, you kind of come together. How do you understand each other's worlds and kind of combine them to create this like time travel novel,
Well, I think the through line for both of us is the heart. It's not so much about the technology and it's not so much about the kind of intermix of past, present, and future. Mm-hmm. It's really about the emotional through line, right? So our book, this book, A Second Chance for Yesterday, is all about the process of the protagonist having to reinvestigate a past that she thought she'd left behind.
Right.
And having to deal emotionally with these things that she had kind of put beyond the horizon and thought, I'll never have to deal with this again. I'll never have to talk to this person again. I'll never have to relive this horrifying moment. And then all of a sudden she's headed in the wrong direction. And all those assumptions turn out to be false.
Right.
And so I think whether you're talking about history or future, what really resonates is the way in which you have to construct a sense of self out of these disparate events of that take place in different time frames.
Right.
And secondarily, there's a romance subplot in this book. And the difficulties of being a human being stuck in your head, stuck in your own narrative,
right,
and having to find a common place with somebody else, with somebody that you might love, despite the fact that you seem to occupy these separate bubbles. Like there's a core truth in that. And the time travel dimension just kind of brings that out in stark relief.
That's so cool. I love it. It sounds right up my alley, to be honest. And it also kind of reminds me of the fact that you can't really escape what's going to be there. And it's like no matter what direction you're going in, it kind of represents itself in a way. That's a word. I don't know if that's a word. But it presents itself in a way kind of like unless you deal with it, you won't really escape it type of situation.
That's exactly right.
That's very cool. I love that. Anything else you'd like to share about the book itself while we're on the topic?
Well, I'll start things off. The book is full of Easter eggs.
Okay.
Like, because Rachel and I have so much shared culture and shared history and so many cultural touchstones in common, we were able to write in a kind of code where the other person understands the kind of deeper ramifications of what we're saying without us having to spell it out to the reader.
Wow. Okay.
So there are a lot of little in-jokes and asides that, you'd have to have grown up in New York City when we were growing up in to get, or you'd have to have experienced a certain kind of cultural moment to get.
Yeah.
But I don't think it takes away from the reader's ability to enjoy the story. I think it creates a kind of like fractal depth to it that you wouldn't find otherwise.
Yeah. And I feel like for you both personally, it's just an added layer that you get to share, which is very cool. Obviously what you're comfortable sharing, but was there just kind of a moment or an incident or an experience that kind of sparked you working together on this novel? Was it just kind of something you two picked up like, let's try it out, let's do this, I've always wanted to do it type of situation? Anything you could speak on in that sense?
Well, both Aram and I have been writing for a long time, and I think that we started creating narratives together as kids, just putting on like plays for suffering family members as kids do, and reading the same books and seeing the same movies and watching the same TV shows and talking about all of these things. So, I mean, I think the novel is probably the outgrowth of, nearly 5 decades. I haven't quite reached that point, nearly 5 decades of conversation and collaboration. And both Aram and I had been engaged in writing fiction separately before we decided to collaborate on something. And then I think we started A Second Chance for Yesterday during the pandemic. And part of the inspiration was about having that sense of connection, during a time when we were all so isolated. And
Absolutely.
so it was just so wonderful to have this project together and to have something to talk about on Zoom during, like the collaborative writing sessions we did. That wasn't just like our fear of, death and the destruction of the world because of the pandemic. So long creative process. The inciting incident, I suspect, was the pandemic, and then sustained by the pleasure that we found in the creative process. And I should also say that we have continued writing, and we have other projects in the pipeline that we hope will
That's amazing.
be able to share with a reading public in the future.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
we're about 2.5 books in together at this point.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and
That's
I'm
awesome.
very, very excited about the book we're writing together right now.
That's so
It's
cool.
called The Future Thief. It's a fantasy novel.
Okay. Can you give us any teaser for that, or?
I
No.
think the less
No,
the less said, the
keep
better.
Yeah.
it to yourself.
I understand
But
that. I understand that.
what I'll say is everything Rachel said about having like a lifeline during the pandemic is 100% true. But on top of that, there's also, as Rachel mentioned, she and I had both, we're both nonfiction authors. We've both written several books as professors.
Right.
And we've both been dabbling in fiction, but hadn't published anything.
Okay.
And I think it's one of those things where, like Rachel was saying before, where we know each other so well.
Right.
When I read Rachel's fiction, I thought, wow, this is fantastic. But secretly, I was like, well, here are the things I would rewrite if I was working on this. And when Rachel read mine, she probably felt the same way.
Yeah.
And so collaborating, we have this ready-made voice that's the midpoint between, her writing style and my writing style.
Right.
And it kind of smooths out both of our idiosyncrasies and excesses in a way that I think makes the voice more coherent and more accessible to readers.
Gotcha. And I have a follow-up question related to something you guys said about working on Zoom. So how does that, although it's a pandemic, and even let's say without a pandemic, that when two people are in two different places, what does that collaboration look like? And do you have any advice for that now that you kind of went through the same situation of, because I know we've had a few alumni on who talk about script writing in different places, whether it be different countries or different continents. So anything you could speak of, any advice rather you have for anyone working on something collaboratively, creatively, but just in two different locations?
Well, luckily, we have all these digital tools now that really do facilitate this sort of collaborative work from a distance. And so Aram and I have tried different software programs, different technologies. We're using a program right now called Dabble Writer, but the program we used to write A Second Chance for Yesterday is Scrivener. For us, the process looked like trading back and forth on the writing. So just passing it back and forth, keeping an online conversation, actually using Slack about what we were planning for the book. And then going over the writing collaboratively in Zoom meetings, every couple of thousand words, reading it out loud and thinking about not just word choice, but the character's motivations or what was happening in a given scene or where we wanted to take the narrative. I think the most critical thing for our collaboration that's made working at a distance successful is we've given each other a lot of ownership over the project. So we made a decision early in the process not to make revisions using track changes, but just to give each other license to edit the text. Uh, and I think that that was important, not just for streamlining the process, but just for giving us both a full sense of ownership over the whole text. And the end result is that even though most of the writing is done, Aram writes, I write, Aram writes, I
Mm-hmm.
write, by the end of the manuscript process, we end up with something that is such a mix of our two voices, because each of us have edited both separately and collaboratively every
Mm-hmm.
sentence in the book. So every sentence ends up having
Huh.
both of our voices in it. And the funny thing is that we both end up forgetting what exactly, who's written what, right? Because it ends up so mixed together.
Right.
And I know that, speaking for myself, as someone who's written a lot of books, as odd as it is, you do tend to forget what you've written in your own book. So sometimes I've had readers and fans of my writing who've asked me questions about, this or that or the other thing I've included in one of my historical books, and I'm like, oh, I can't remember anymore. Did I say that, or is
Right.
that what happened? You tell me. You seem to be more familiar with this text than I am. So, like, I know, speaking as an individual, that I tend to forget what I've written in the
Mm-hmm.
past, but it's very funny to have this collaborative writing process where I end up forgetting like what I came up with and what Aram came up with.
There's so
But
much
it's
beauty to
actually
that,
it's
though.
really wonderful, because the book ends up
Yeah.
feeling like its own independent living text somehow, that I
Right.
am attached to, but is not me. It's like your children, go off and become their own human beings.
Yeah. It's like you both took yourselves and created a new human being that's kind of
Very
like
much.
taking this voice and moving with it, which is awesome.
Yeah, A Sinn is their own
Right.
author
Right.
and has their own style and their
Right.
own interests, and
Yeah.
and I love that.
That's so cool. And one quick thing. So I just heard you say you would read the text out loud to each other. I know in script writing, we always were taught, like, read the dialogue out loud, because when you read it out loud, it'll sound a lot differently. Does that go for the same when you're writing a novel? Is it kind of that same idea of it's going to help you kind of hear something you wouldn't normally hear?
Oh, totally. There's stuff that looks fine on the page, and then when you try to read it out loud,
Yeah.
you can't get it out of your mouth, right? And then there are also, so each of us, every writer has their own tics. Certain turns of phrase you might use more frequently than you think you do.
Yes.
Certain words you keep going back to, or metaphors. And, it's easy for us to see that in other people, but not in ourselves.
Right.
So it's, in a way, it really helps our partnership that when we read out loud, Rachel can say, you see how you did that there? You did it the same as the other way. Why don't we change it this time?
Yeah.
And, if she were just kind of editing my work on the page, I might like take umbrage at that and say, well, that's the way I write.
Right.
But when you read it out loud, there's something so persuasive about hearing the poetry of the language and hearing it when the language doesn't reach that level of poetry and needs to be massaged.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And another follow-up to that. So obviously you write this novel. Can you talk about what comes next once the novel is done in terms of the publishing process? So the reason why we started this podcast actually is because we love bringing on alumni or professors or staff or anyone really who can kind of teach our students a little something they may not know. And I know a lot of students who are thinking about going into that, authorship road have a lot of questions about what does that publishing process look like, and specifically, what are you seeking out in a publisher? Kind of that, what we call today red flag, green flag. What are the red flags that you try to look for, and then what are some green flags that you try to look for as well, where you say, okay, this could be a good pairing for us, a good partnership, whatever that may be. And admittedly, I don't know too much about it, so I'm going to learn from you all as well.
First of all, you're lucky to get your first novel published by anyone.
Okay.
Right? Like
Good to know.
if like Skullduggery Press out of Akron, Ohio, with like 3 readers wanted to publish our novel, we would
go
been
for
like,
it. Yeah.
Like, please take it. We got very lucky
Okay.
that we had an agent who believed in
Gotcha.
in the manuscript and sold it to a publisher who's a pretty major science fiction publisher, and has great faith in the project and great marketing and distribution power. But the best thing about working with them so far is that our editor, a woman named Amy Borsuk at Rebellion, gave us such insightful feedback on our manuscript that we were able to go back even after they'd already bought it and do another round of revisions that made the book incalculably better.
Wow. Okay.
Like, she reminded us that because she's a pro, and up until now we weren't,
Right.
that there are these emotional beats that you need to check in with the reader and kind of remind them how the character is feeling at intervals. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but somehow we'd managed to write an 85,000 word book without doing that enough. And so we went back through it and really kind of at crucial junctures in the narrative thought about, like, how is this character feeling? How can we be plain about this? Like, let's not be coy. Let's not couch it in, metaphors and similes. Let's just kind of tell the reader, like, the character feels X, right? And I really think the book would not have connected as well with readers as it has already if we hadn't had that partnership with the editor. Right. So that every time I sell a book from now on, that's what I'll be looking for is an editor who's willing to tell me, I love this book. Here's what I would love even more if you could do that before we publish it.
Yeah, that's such a specific point. I love that. And Rachel, anything to add to that?
I second what Aram's saying about looking for an editor who will give you editorial feedback. It is hard to find because the publishing industry, people are overworked and overstretched, and there's not a lot of space for that feedback. That's always what I've looked for with my nonfiction manuscripts as well as with fiction, because I am a big believer in the power of good editing to improve a text.
Absolutely.
I do think there's a recent book that came out, and I can't remember what the title was, but it's something like, writing a history of failure. And I think that's not the right title. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
And what I would say to anybody who is trying to publish a book, whatever the genre, or publish anything, whatever the genre is, that the endeavor of being a writer just involves constant failure, and you have to make your peace with that. And there might be some rare souls out there who just succeed in all their endeavors and off the first shot, but it's not me, and it's not most of us. And so you just have to develop a thick skin and be willing to fail at things and enjoy the creative process enough that you keep doing it regardless of your lack of success. And honestly, this applies for all sorts of published authors who are out there. They're just failing all the time, and it's just a hard creative endeavor, and it's a hard business.
I want to mention one more important dimension of our collaboration, which is that we actually read a lot together.
Oh, interesting.
So Rachel and I, we're both avid readers, like most writers are.
Yeah.
And we don't read everything the same, but we will at least once a month, we'll read one of the same books, and we'll end up talking about it and say, sometimes it's a popular book that we both end up hating.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a kind of hidden gem that we both end up loving. Sometimes we feel differently about it. But talking about other people's books together and being like, oh, I love how they did this, or it's, something about the language isn't connecting with me. That becomes a touchstone for us when we're writing together. So we can be like, oh, remember that thing that author did? Let's steal that.
It's
let's make that
your
work
own
for us.
vision board almost through these books. Yeah.
Like a conceptual vision board.
Right. Yeah. That's awesome. And just a question for anyone wondering. So did you have an agent when you were writing nonfiction as well? Is the agent something you acquired when you went into the fiction world?
I was working with an agent for an earlier fiction project, which my agent valiantly tried to sell, but I had broken some genre rules in the composition of the novel that I was unwilling to amend. Okay. So that novel didn't sell, but I already had an agent I had gotten from that project, and then she took us on as a duo.
Okay, that's awesome.
None of my nonfiction books have ever had an agent.
Wow, okay.
Typically, unless you're a superstar academic or kind of a professional BS artist like Malcolm Gladwell, you're not going to sell enough books to be worthwhile for an agent to try to get their 15%.
I'm going to pick up a nonfiction. Right, okay, gotcha.
Trying to make friends, Aram.
I calls it like I sees it,
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, academic presses are some of the last presses presses standing that will accept unagented submissions. Commercial presses will not accept unagented submissions, except for like the very rare independent press. Some of them do, but for the most part, commercial publishers don't accept unagented submissions. And if you send something in, it'll disappear somewhere into the void.
Wow. Okay.
So you do have to have an agent to submit, but there are all sorts of interesting ways. It's hard to get an agent, but there are all these interesting ways you can try. Back when I used to participate in Twitter before it got purchased, I used to see people use the hashtag, like sometimes there'd be like a pitch hashtag pitch Friday or something, or a hashtag for a manuscript wish list. I think it was MSWL. And these were ways in which agents would communicate with unagented writers. So if there was one of these pitch events, and like lots of writers without agents would, put up like a 2-sentence pitch about their novel and use that hashtag. And so that was actually really fun. And then there's all these websites I found useful when I was looking for an agent initially, like Query. There was like a great one, I can't remember what it's called now, like Shark Query. Cool. Talking about giving advice on like how to write a query letter and all the rest.
Right.
There's a lot of information out there that I found super useful as an aspiring fiction writer.
And we also read a few books about it too, right? Like Story Genius, and there are various books that kind of...
Well, that's about
structuring a narrative.
And I really recommend that book. I like it a lot. Yeah. I've found it useful. So I'm a eager consumer of advice about writing. It's something I talk about with my students all the time. I do get a lot of like compliments from people about like my nonfiction prose, like, oh, you're such a good writer. I mean, that sort of thing. And which is not necessarily true, but my response is like, writing is something that you can continuously, keep trying to learn, right? Like I keep reading writing guides. I read what writers have to say. I read like George Saunders writing about how to write. I read various like Jack Hart's guide to how to write creative nonfiction, Ursula Gwyn's book about how to write science fiction, on and on. I'm always out, like it's a never-ending process learning how to write. And so
that's great. I feel like when you love something, it's like you always want to improve on it. And it's like when it's your passion project, it's like a forever passion project. That's how I feel about film and
we live in this weird society that has these ideas about art, like, artists are these creative geniuses, and their projects are kind of born fully grown in their minds.
Right.
And therefore, whatever you put down on the page is like perfect as it is. And like that's all such nonsense.
Right.
Like writing is it's a craft. You can learn to do it. You can learn to be better at it.
Yep.
You can imitate the way that other people do it to get good at it yourself. It's much more like, I don't know, I'm not a sports person, but I'd imagine it's much more like playing sports than like, this kind of mythical, gift from the muses that people talk about.
Yeah, I completely agree. Actually, we go through a lot of that in the film industry, I feel like, and it's just this constant reminder that like whether it's your first film or your 50th film, you're probably going to go about it the same way, and that you're going to go back and edit, you're going to go back and make those notes. Constructive criticism is everywhere. So that's great. That's awesome. And we do have 5 minutes left. Do you guys, are you willing to do a rapid fire?
Hit us.
Awesome. Okay, so is there a book that sparked your love for storytelling? And it can be literally anything you've ever read.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
That's a good one.
I think that was my first one-shot book. Like I found it in summer camp on my friend's bunk when I was 11.
Yeah.
And I didn't get up until I'd read the whole book.
That's awesome.
Aram and I had a bunch of paperback. We shared rooms as a kid because we grew up in New York City. And so there was no room. And so there were paperbacks that were just like on the floor of our room that I think we read over and over again. Hitchhikers was one of them. And also Dune. I think we had like a very well thumbed copy of Dune. I'm trying to think of what else was like on the floor.
There was some Kurt Vonnegut, like Slaughterhouse-Five and Sirens of Titan.
Slaughterhouse-Five. Yeah, Aram read a lot of Stanislaw Lem and Kurt Vonnegut. I loved the Little House series as a kid.
Oh,
I
yep,
read
yep.
Laura Ingalls Wilder over and over and over again. I probably read Little House on the Prairie 100 times as a child. D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. Loved
Oh
that
yeah,
one.
that was in regular rotation.
We had the Lamb Child Shakespeare. Someone got us that, which I loved as a kid.
Oh, Sherlock Holmes. We read a lot of Sherlock Holmes.
Read a
Especially
ton of
me.
Sherlock Holmes. Phantom Tollbooth. That was one my mother did not like, but I think
Because it
Aaron and
was
I both
preachy.
liked it.
That's.
Susan Cooper. I loved all the Susan Coopers.
I was like a horror fanatic, so I was the kid checking out all the Goosebumps, and like
R.L.
all
Stein.
Yep.
Yeah, there's
that
like a
was
gazillion
Way
of
too
them.
old for R.L. Stein.
Yeah, our little brother was into that
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
that's awesome.
Our younger brother was.
And then your favorite genre for escapism?
Jane Austen.
That's
If
your
I want to
favorite genre?
if I want to fully inhabit like
I like that
another
that's a
universe,
genre.
I will read
Yeah.
a Jane
A
Austen
Jane
novel.
Austen novel, yeah.
So I read a lot of genre fiction. I read a lot of everything. I do read romance for escapism. Unfortunately, it interferes with my well-being because I can't fall asleep and I end up staying out till like 3 a.m. So that is my guilty secret. A lot of sci-fi, some fantasy, literary fiction, speculative
Metafiction.
fiction. That's sort of where I see Aram and I entering the field. I can
Yeah,
see
we're
both,
like
the
massive
things we've been
David
working
Mitchell
on all as
fans.
speculative
Okay.
fiction.
If you know David Mitchell, who wrote Cloud Atlas and
Yeah,
Bone
yeah.
Clocks. We're both massive
Love
fans
it.
of Ted Chiang. I mean, this is like a golden era we're living
Yeah.
through right now of speculative fiction.
That's awesome. And then last question, a place you've traveled to that inspired your writing? Or a spot? A location? New York. Has New York inspired your
look,
writing?
we grew up in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
We spent our whole misspent youths in Greenwich Village. Like that's all you need.
Yeah.
You know.
I was going to say that is like a great place to grow up in terms of just being so culturally exposed to so many different, there's so many different people. It's like a melting pot.
Yeah, we could mine that for like centuries and
Yeah.
never run out of good stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Aram and Rachel, thank you so much for coming on Media in the Mix. You're our first authors.
We are so honored and so thankful.
Oh, of
It's great to be on.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us.
I can't wait to read the book, to be honest.
Thank you.
I'm excited. So congratulations. And we hope to see more from A Sinn in the future.
Oh, you will, I promise.
We hope to provide more in the future.
We hope to prepare. Yeah, that's what it's about, right?
It's all in the works.
Thank you both so much.